Welcome to Theological Table Talk, the podcast of the Center for Christian Studies. I'm joined today by Todd Hall, my colleague. Hey Todd, how's it going?
Hey, yeah, it's early.
Okay, yeah, it's early, but we have our coffee, so hope all of our listeners out there are sufficiently caffeinated or getting there as well. We're happy today to be joined by Kyle Harper. Kyle Harper is a professor of classics and letters at the University of Oklahoma, and Kyle just did for us last night our Center for Christian Studies First Things lecture here in Austin. So Kyle, we're so glad to have you with us this morning for this conversation.
Thank you. Been fun to be here in Austin, which is enemy territory for me as a diehard Sooner, but can't deny that I've been treated very well, and been a very stimulating visit. Looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, good. Okay. And you said that Austin has so far in every way lived up to the hype. That's good and bad, I guess.
Every single possible way. The food, the music, the absolute weirdos. Nothing is disappointed.
Good. Okay. Well, that's good to hear. I'll keep that in mind for our future guests as well. Well, we want to get right to it. We've got several questions that we want to just pick your brain on. A couple of them have to do with some of your books. One of your books, the one I've read from cover to cover, I think you've got 4 major books that have come out so far, but the one called From Shame to Sin, The Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality in Late Antiquity. I was reading recently, just kind of glancing back through Bertrand Russell's old book called Why I Am Not a Christian. And his chapter on, the chapter title that I was looking at is, Has Religion Made Useful Contributions to Civilization? So if you're not familiar, you just listeners, if you're not familiar with Bertrand Russell, he was like the new atheist before the new atheists. And probably a little better than some of what they had to offer. So has religion made useful contributions? His answer to that is mostly no. But the very first subheading in that chapter is Christianity and sex. And so the opening sentence or sentences of that chapter I'm quoting now. Quote, "The worst feature of the Christian religion, however, is its attitude towards sex. An attitude so morbid and so unnatural that it can be understood only when taken in relation to the sickness of the civilized world at the time the Roman Empire was decaying. We sometimes hear talk to the effect that Christianity improved the status of women. This is one of the grossest perversions of history that it is possible to make." End quote. All right. So, Russell, I think, reflects a criticism that is really common in the secular world, and it's I would say, fueled in some ways the anti-Christian sexual revolution of the 1960s, the idea that Christianity is nothing but repressive of women and of sexuality, and that's the whole story. So I'm just wondering, with you having looked at the Christian sexual revolution of late antiquity, and that's kind of what he's talking about. You know, the Roman Empire was decaying. That's the only, such a sick society. It's the only way you could have something sick like Christian sexuality come to dominate. So where does he go wrong with that? Because it's such a common way of thinking now, I'd like just to hear you address, where does he go wrong? And is there a kernel of truth in anything that he says there?
Well, I think I would start by saying Bertrand Russell was one of the most important philosophers of the early 20th century, first half. And I don't think you want to go in this direction, but he did like sex, and that's fairly on the record, and especially with other people's wives. So
I was not aware of that. So that
in a relatively colorful life. But we'll set that aside. That's for a different podcast on the history of philosophy.
I think it's not irrelevant though. If you don't like Christian morals, then
well, there's something certainly honest about his book, why he's not a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think you put it well, that there certainly is a kernel of truth to it, but there's also much more to be said. And I don't think that he's entirely wrong in say, let me try and actually make his case for him in a little better way, because I'm a historian, and he could probably beat me in a conversation on logic. But if I were to try and make the case that he's arguing for in an informed way, I would say that the pre-Christian cultures of Greece and Rome celebrate eros, the Greek word for love, but for love of a very particular kind, a very physical, erotic love. It's of course where we get our word erotic. That is an appreciation for the physical pleasure of sex, and there's no doubt that pre-Christian cultures celebrate that in a very direct, very frank, very open way. Eros is quite literally a god. It's a deity that's worshipped, is considered in the Greek and Roman mythological imagination to be the child of Aphrodite or Venus, the goddess of love and sex. This is Latin Cupid, so you've all heard of Eros. And the core thing that everybody knows about Cupid is that he shoots arrows and people fall in love. And that's actually not a bad place to start for Greek and Roman ideas of Eros, that it's a part of nature, that it's physical, that it is part of who we are, and that it is something powerful and dangerous. And the Cupid arrow myth kind of gets at that, right? That it's something that can drive people crazy, that can take over themselves, that can swallow up their reason, their rational capacity. And we know that the Greek and Romans worship this god, and they celebrate sexual pleasure in certain ways. And I think for anyone who's ever been to, say, Pompeii and had the opportunity to see in this amazing, of course, tragic preservation of a city by volcanic eruption, Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples, that gives us certain kinds of insights into what life was like just one random day in the late first century. And you can see just from the material archaeological traces of that world that the pre-Christian world really is a different world. There are phallic symbols all over. There are erotic scenes that we would consider X-rated. Is that still a thing? X-rated?
We're way beyond that.
I don't know.
I know what you mean.
You know what I mean? Dating, or younger listeners may have to look that up. But like X-rated, sexually explicit mosaics that people used to think originally, the historians and archaeologists thought, oh, that mosaic must be from like a brothel. And it turns out these are just ordinary houses. These are just people's living in dining rooms where the mosaics portray people, let's just say, in the throes of erotic happiness, in a way that's very explicit and very direct. And so could go on and on, but this is definitely a society that valorizes Eros in a very central way. And so I'm making Russell's case for him. I'm trying to be fair about it, and I think he has a kernel of the truth there. So where I say that that's far from the entire story, however, is that I think it's important to understand other really fundamental parts of the way that society worked and how Christianity is different. So Christianity almost never even uses the word eros. It's invisible in the New Testament, which is one of those things that's really maybe so fundamentally surprising that we should stop and pause on it more. That the word love is in the New Testament pervasively, but never eros. So that starts to put us onto the trail that something is very different about the worldview of the writers of the New Testament. So we need to understand more fully the world that could produce the erotic mosaics of Pompeii, and that could that could help us understand what the writers of the New Testament, the world that's around them, what's surrounding them. And what I would emphasize that Russell is certainly leaving out is that the apparent celebration of frank physical sexuality is also embedded in a social system where very fundamentally the rules of the game, both laws, literally the legal order of society, as well as the cultural norms that are publicly shared and shape people's expectations, people's rights, people's powers, are fundamentally embedded in rules of status, in systems of extreme hierarchy, in which it's fundamentally important that a significant part of the population, we don't really know number-wise, in a place like Pompeii, it was probably 10-20% of the population at least, are enslaved and don't have any power or control over the fate of their own bodies. And it's a society where the sexual access to what the society considers honorable or respectable women is extremely restricted. And so this is an honor society where in many cases in the Mediterranean, women are partially or even fully veiled. In many ways, walking around a Greek city, like the ones that the first Christians live in, would feel much, much more like a Southeast Mediterranean or Arab society today, in that the presence and the cultural norms around bodies, particularly of women, is very, very alien to us. And so women who are of free status and who are destined for marriage and reproduction are often very restricted, are very often married very, very young, in their mid-teens very often, and are expected to be virgins when they're married and chaste within marriage. I think there's something very revealing that there's not a word in Latin or Greek for male virgin. You actually can't say it. You can't say it without sounding really funny. And there are some imperial Roman texts that actually make this play on words, because the word for it is really maiden. There's no equivalent that's masculine for a virgin, and so you have to say something like a male maiden, which is a very, linguistically awkward construction. So for men, the rules are completely different, because men have free sexual access to women who aren't within the circle of honorable women. And so that means, by and large, slaves, male and female, as well as prostitutes, many of whom are slaves. And so the culture that celebrates Eros is also one in which the access to it is very, very profoundly shaped by who you are, by whether you're male or female, by whether you're free or slave, by whether you're honored or shamed by society. And there are so many dimensions of a system like that that I think even in good faith Russell wouldn't want to accept. So there are parts of what he claims that are true. I think the early Christian movement certainly doesn't celebrate Eros anything like the way that the Greeks and the Romans had. But also there's a kind of egalitarianism and respect for people that cuts through the rules of status, and certainly there's a very different model of love, of what proper love is, grounded in Christian ideas of agape, that are very alien to the Greco-Roman society around it. So I think he's onto something, that Christianity is very different, but I would probably say that he only tells part of the story.
Yeah, to me the thing that sticks out the most from that quote that I read is this idea that Christianity improving the status of women, he says, is one of the grossest perversions of history that it's possible to make. But that seems like one of the more obvious things to me, if I'm understanding all of this correctly, is that it improves the status of women, particularly of these the slaves the ones who were set for a life of either prostitution or having no control over their bodies. He doesn't use the phrase repression of women, but that's what he seems to be saying. Whereas the Christian sexual ethic, if it's repressing anyone, it seems like it's repressing men.
Free men who formerly had total normative access to dishonored women. No, that's right. I mean, I think he's wrong to say that it's a gross perversion to imply that Christianity improved the status of women. I think that it's a complicated question, and I don't think that early Christianity was arguing for equal rights. There's certainly pretty strong traces of the kind of Greco-Roman patriarchal society that are still visible in the New Testament, and particularly in the household codes. But at the same time, there's something very different about even the Christian model of marriage and the kind of reciprocity that's implied. That is, I think, goes beyond what was normative, even in philosophical circles in the Roman Empire, and the implication that husbands and wives have mutual obligations and that the marriage relationship can be grounded in agape is very different and does in some ways improve the relative status of women. But there are other ways in which probably Christianity isn't liberating for women, certainly in the first centuries anyway. But yeah, I don't think he's after a really balanced assessment here.
I guess not. So in many pagan or pre-Christian cultures, there is this idea of the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, where marriage and sexuality and procreation, all of those things together are a reflection of creation, of the God's relationship with the world. And so a marriage and a sexual relationship and procreation are all reflecting that and in some ways participating in that. And so I'm wondering, like, the prominence of this imagery in a place like Pompeii, let's just say the Greco-Roman world, but we see it in other societies as well, ancient societies. You get a hint of that, I think, in the Old Testament with a book like Song of Songs. You get a little more explicit statement of that in Ephesians 5 when Paul says, I'm talking not about marriage, but Christ in the church, and then using just extended analogy or metaphor here. So does Christianity retain any of that? I know there are different restrictions, and we've talked about that and the reciprocity in that chaste relationship, but does that survive? It seems to me like it's sort of it doesn't survive in many ways, but just kind of some of
not much is the short answer, but I'll give a longer answer. And I think to stick with Eros just for 1 second longer, that there is a really broad and important cultural movement that's visible in the Roman Empire, that's really reflected in texts like ancient Greek novels that celebrate Eros in the context of marital love. And that in itself is interesting and new. And there's an element, there are these very interesting stories that become very popular in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century that are completely pagan. And there are stories in which a boy and a girl fall in love, and the world tries to keep them apart. But ultimately they survive trial and separation, and they're united, and the story's ending is that they're married, and it's usually implicit that they procreate. They're kind of charming stories, and they're somewhat different from the kind of arid norms of social reproduction that had existed, and they're often still very common in practice, that marriage is about reproducing the family, marriage is really chosen by the parents. I mean, in the Greco-Roman world, most marriages are in effect what we would call arranged marriages. They're not, people don't date, they don't find their soulmate. Mom and dad want grandchildren so that the property can be passed down in the family line. And what these stories say is actually somewhat different. It says that actually marriage can be about people who choose their partner, people who fall in love, people who are reciprocally in love. They're very interesting stories, and it is a very, very erotic kind of love. They're physically attracted to each other. But what's interesting to me is the religious and spiritual dimensions of that, because it really, I wouldn't say it's participating in creation, because these aren't Judeo-Christian stories of a linear cosmos. These are Greek stories of a cyclical cosmos, and they say that human marriage and sex is part of the natural cycles of life and death and rebirth. And they're very interesting. They're very this-worldly texts. They say that your sexuality, your marriage, your ability to reproduce really is natural and belongs to the physical world, that it's very much like animals, that in a sense, just as they have the miracle of reproducing life, so we also have the capacity to participate in the natural cycles of reproduction. So I say that because that's a kind of live cultural option in the Christian world, and yet again there's a very deliberate and explicit decision not to go that direction. And Christian marriage doesn't use that language or those values or norms. It's something very, very different, and very little of the kind of marriage is a part of the cycles of nature's reproduction, generation after generation, in the very literal sense of generation. That doesn't, I think, have many residues in early Christianity. Instead, early Christians are, by and large, trying to make sense of the core of the teachings in the Gospels, as well as the Pauline letters, to work out an ethic of love, sex, marriage, reproduction. And there is, of course, some influence of the Jewish inheritance. But what's striking to me as a historian is how utterly little of the Jewish inheritance shapes Christian sexuality. I mean, Judaism has no qualms about marital sex. Judaism, I mean, for one thing, it's still, and to a certain extent, even in the early Christian period, polygamous, or at least normatively permits polygamy. So there's lots of things going on in the Jewish inheritance that just don't leave traces in the Christian legacy. The Christian sexual ethic is, I think, even a sharp break with the Jewish inheritance, and very, very quickly. And so, to me, and it's not everyone would agree with that, but to me, it seems like already by the late first and certainly second century, Christians are trying to make sense of what did Paul mean, and it's not totally apparent, because he says, "I wish all could be as I am," and that seems to imply, and I certainly think means, everyone would have the gift of lifelong celibacy. But marriage is permitted. It's allowed by way of concession, not command. And that's radical, and it's ultimately pretty challenging for the early church. So we know that right down to the end of the 4th century, the church is debating whether marriage is a lesser good or a lesser evil. Think about that. It's a really deep question. Is marriage a lesser good than the gift of lifelong celibacy? Or is marriage actually just a lesser evil than, say, fornication? That marriage is allowed, but only so that people don't fall into worse temptations. This is debated by the mainstream church for centuries. So I think that's immediately an indication that it's not something that's so overwhelmingly obvious that early Christians didn't interpret their inheritance very differently. But ultimately, the Orthodox position is that marriage is a secondary good, that marriage is not a permitted sin or a permitted evil, but marriage is good. Now, think about maybe the most familiar text that comes out of the very late phases of this discussion is Augustine's On the Good of Marriage. Why did he have to write a book called On the Good of Marriage? To underscore that marriage is still, in Orthodox Christian doctrine, a good thing and not a sort of permissible evil that prevents worse kinds of evil. It was necessary to say that. Now, he's not saying marriage is the best or the highest state. Of course, he thinks that that celibacy is the greater spiritual gift. But marriage definitely, as he articulates, is a good thing, and procreation is part of that. And so, there, to come back to your original question that got this going, there is a thread of Christian belief and doctrine in the early church that is important, that does see something positive in the potential for procreation, that sees it as participating in the goodness of creation. And this ends up being deeply intertwined as well with really long, enduring debates with various flavors of Gnostic belief that are very powerful and lively in the background of the conversation. We don't always see it in the Orthodox text, but remember that other side of the conversation was always there. And one of its tenets is that the creation is actually inherently corrupt, and so it's a rejection of the Orthodox view of Genesis, that God is the creator of a good creation. And so questions about sex and marriage and reproduction are very often right there below the surface. There's this much deeper debate going on that has very high stakes about, is the cosmos created by God, is the cosmos good? Because Gnostics say, and there's lots of different groups of Gnostics, but in essence, a Gnostic position is that the creation is inherently corrupt. It's made of matter, and matter is, that's the bad stuff. We want to be sons of light. We want to escape from the corruption and evil of this cosmos as it is. And to do that is to escape the body, and to do that is to become an enlightened being of the sort that doesn't need or want and certainly participate in sex and procreation. And so the Orthodox position is doing battle always, and usually not very far in the background, with this Gnostic position that would see procreation as something that's wrong because it's participating in the reproduction of a material cosmos, of a created order that is inherently, because it's made of matter, flawed and corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's, I'm thinking in Paul, it seems primarily eschatological. And so, for the first couple of generations, maybe all that's in the background, the kingdom has come and is coming and stuff. But, by the time you're in the 4th century, it's been a little while.
It's been a while. That's absolutely sort of one of the things that makes the conversation always complicated, is probably the texts that we have of Paul that are probably written in the 50s. There's clearly an eschatology that's never very far from what he's writing. And even when it's not explicit, it's sort of framing the way he thinks. And for later inheritors of those letters and texts, when the sort of imminent expectation of some kind of break in the flow of time doesn't happen, then how does that affect the interpretation of those words that were written in the framework where there seems to be that expectation?
Your book is that we're talking about is entitled From Shame to Sin. So I'm just wondering how those categories, you clearly mean something by them. How do they reflect this transition? You talked a little bit about, in passing, kind of the honor-shame culture. How does that reflect the transition from a pagan sexual ethic to a Christian one?
Well, do you mind if I give a short answer for a change?
Okay, yeah,
I kind of already hit on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to say that the Christians still talk about shame and pre-Christians talk about sin, but I take these words to be symbolic of the whole moral system of pre-Christian and then Christian sexual norms. And by shame, I mean the fundamentally social system of sexual norms that I think is really fundamental to understanding pre-Christian sexual cultures, the world that Paul and others are moving in, where who you are, your place in society is going to be fundamental, foundational to what the world tells you is right and wrong. Whereas by sin, I mean a moral framework where the individual is first and foremost free and the subject of right and wrong, of judgment before divinity, before God. And the sort of shape or framing of the whole world of moral rules that surround sex and marriage and reproduction, I think undergo a deep shift in the kind of logic and framing, and that I try and encapsulate with this short phrase.
Yeah, that's good. I'm asking you now to do maybe a little prognostication, but if
historians like to look backwards.
Yeah, I know.
In fact, we're as a tribe, we're notably bad at predicting the future.
Yes, okay.
Probably the least reliable futurists.
Well, on that note, then, if the Christian sexual revolution of antiquity can be characterized from shame to sin, as you have, how would you, or maybe how would historians centuries from now characterize what we've seen over the last 60 years or so, which I would say is an anti-Christian sexual revolution? It's not from shame to sin. What is it?
Yeah, and again, I'll try and answer a big question concisely, which isn't my greatest gift. But I will say that I don't think, and I'm not a good prognosticator, I don't think that in the future they will look back and say that it was a transition from sin to shame. In other words, I think that secularization, which is maybe one way to frame it, the transition to a public sphere in which non-sectarian and putatively universally reasonable arguments and norms provide the limits to legitimate public discourse. I don't think that that's just stripping away Christianity and then leaving what was there before. And so it's not a kind of reversal. It's not just getting rid of religiously imposed repression, searching for the word you'd used, that is left behind. Instead, I think it's something that's more complicated, and maybe in the future it'll be clearer that in the Charles Taylor sense, secularization isn't just a kind of stripping away or dusting off certain kind of religious values. In fact, much of the Christian Revolution in late antiquity really is at the core of what we just think of as shared, public, available to reason, legitimate norms, and the kind of respect for individual autonomy actually is maybe defensible in terms of public reason. I think it is, but is also just objectively, factually, something that develops over the course of certainly Western history under the strong influence of Christian norms. So in some ways, stripping away Christianity actually leaves behind a lot of the Christian revolution. And I think that also helps to see what really is different, that the kind of individual expressivism that's characteristic of modernity is in deep ways different from the Christian inheritance. So it is, of course, a deep change that in many ways is a shift away from Christian values. But actually I think it's very complicated to imagine that in some sense that it's just sort of erasing a religious legacy. I don't think that really captures the depth of the world we live in. But again, the least reliable person to predict the future is somebody who spends all their time faced backwards looking into the past.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to also just raise briefly here another one of your books called Plagues Upon the Earth, and just note to our listeners that you were talking about pandemics before it was cool to talk about pandemics.
Yes.
And you, like all of us, but maybe even more, are sick of pandemic talk.
Yeah, who doesn't have a little bit of pandemic fatigue?
That's right.
I got very interested in the pandemics in the Roman world, and for lots of reasons, just find totally fascinating the influence of biology, and particularly of infectious diseases, which have played a really, really crucial role in the history of our species. And so I got really hooked on the history of pandemics, and was writing a book that was going to say that a new pandemic was inevitable, and got scooped, which was in some ways good, but you certainly don't have to explain basic things about immunity or the evolution of new variants. Like, who doesn't have some knowledge of these things that just a few years ago were not part of the normal public conversation? So the pandemic arose, and I had to quit everything I was doing and focus on writing this book. I took my first ever sabbatical and wrote the last half or 2/3 of it in enormous haste to try and get out there, because now there's a whole genre of books, pretty much every angle you can think of on pandemics, including pandemic history, but was able to get it out, still kind of in the midst of the pandemic.
What would be, if you can just summarize, I know it's a very large book, but just summarize kind of your angle on it, or maybe interesting takeaways or things you learned that surprised you in doing the reading and research?
I mean, infectious diseases are a really fundamental dimension of human history, and we can really understand our history better by trying to include the world around us, including the microbes that cause sickness and death. I think a couple of the big takeaways for me are that the infectious diseases we suffer are not really normal. Like, humans have a very unusual burden of infectious disease, and the reason why is us, that our infectious diseases are paradoxically a product of our success as a species. And so the technology and the complexity of human societies that have increased so much over time have actually created the environment for the emergence of our pathogens. And most of the infectious diseases, we have a very unusual number of diseases. So, like, there's no other animal that suffers the array of really diverse and really nasty infectious diseases. Like, we're totally off the spectrum. And most of these diseases are not extremely ancient. So they evolve really in relatively recent time, which I would call like the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. To me, that's recent. But we might think that, the germs like plague have been around for eons. But they're really products of the past and of the recent past. Smallpox is not very old at all. Measles is not very old at all. Tuberculosis is not very old at all. Instead, it's the growth of human populations, the growth of cities, the growth of trade networks, the domestication of animals that brings us into close contact with our animals and with their waste matter, that creates a disease environment that spins up new disease after new disease, and sometimes these are very, very disruptive. And so the emergence of plague, the emergence of malaria, the emergence of smallpox, the emergence of cholera in more modern times has played an enormous role, because these are really disruptive events that can really affect the course of societies. And one of I'd say in many ways, the greatest change in the basic experience of life of our species has happened over the last 150 years or so with the control of infectious disease that provides longevity and stability. So, most of us come from families of, on average, 2.1 children. And that's been the case for 2 or 3 generations. But you go back, really, it's not that long, 4 or 5 generations. And you kind of can look in the old family albums and the great-great-grandmas that, she was one of 12.
Yeah.
And the reason is because it was so recent that humans gained control over infectious diseases. And right down until the late 19th century, most people, most of the time, died of infectious causes. So we live in a world where COVID, even with COVID, most people die of chronic or degenerative or organ diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and so on. Essentially, none of those are of infectious origin. So it's not a little microbe getting in you. But that's extremely recent. Right into the late 19th century, most people died of little microbes, bacteria like tuberculosis or most of the gastroenteric diseases, of viruses, particularly respiratory viruses. People died of protozoal infections like malaria, and so on. So thanks to modern scientific advances, and above all, the main 2 things are not always what people think they are. It's clean water and vaccines. If you could only pick 2 things, those are the things you would keep, would be water treatment and vaccines. Antibiotics help, but antibiotics actually come along late in the day. They're very nice. Trust me, you want to have antibiotics. But it's really an array of things, from changes in culture and hygiene. Water treatment, again, is like the most important thing. Vaccines, starting with smallpox, and then so on. Right on through like oral rehydration therapy. It's actually baffling and hard to imagine how important getting fluids is in the case of severe dehydrating infectious diseases, diarrheal diseases. So because of all of those things, human life expectancy has more than doubled. Even in the most underdeveloped and underprivileged societies in the world today, life expectancy has doubled. And in many cases, it's almost tripled. And so we live in a world that's unimaginably different because we've controlled infectious disease. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize with the book is we have this array of tools, and you need it all because it's like a multi-layer defense. You want vaccines to prevent particularly viral diseases. Like if we hadn't had the smallpox vaccine, we would still be living a horrific, barbaric, unpredictable existence. That's like your frontline defense. Then you need water treatment, you need good hygiene, you need antibiotics, you need oral rehydration therapy. So it's like a 7-layer system of defense with moats and barriers and walls. And even with this whole toolkit, stuff happens. There's no conquering infectious disease. It will always be, for any foreseeable horizon, a threat. Both old diseases that can still affect people and still do affect people. People still get influenza. It's a very serious disease. People still die of influenza. Also, diseases evolve resistance. So one of the kind of weird X factors that should get more attention than it does is the fact that tuberculosis, which is one of the greatest killers in human history, I would hazard to guess tuberculosis has killed more human beings than anything else in the history of the planet. And it is slowly evolving resistance to antibiotic pharmaceuticals. It's not a good thing when your worst enemy is still out there and it still kills millions of people every year, not in the United States, but in India in particular, but other countries. And it is slowly and quietly figuring out little tricks to get around frontline antibiotics. And in many cases, there are only very small number of fairly exotic antibiotics that still work against TB. So that's still a threat. And then new diseases. New diseases evolve constantly, and some challenge that multi-layer defense system that we've built. And it happens over and over. And even though we've gained tremendous control over infectious diseases, that almost creates even more incentive for microbes to come after us, because now there are 8 billion humans, and it's a very good business if you can figure out how to take advantage of that. The coronavirus is a huge success from its perspective in figuring out how to get around our controls and to take advantage of us. And so it was absolutely inevitable. I mean, COVID-19 is not a deviation from the patterns of history. It was really strict obedience to the basic dynamics of infectious disease, and it follows in a line of near misses and other catastrophic new diseases like AIDS, like polio before it, and so on. So the book was written before COVID-19 was a thing, or was conceived before COVID-19 was a thing. But of course, in the end, I have just a couple of pages. So if you have COVID-19 fatigue, as I do, the book is still about 99% not about COVID-19, but maybe it'll put it into a little perspective, and so can give you a little richer sense of the background.
That's good. Yeah, thanks for the summary there. Add to the conditions that you mentioned that have spawned and helped evolve all of these diseases over time, the human success and population growth and all of those things. Add to that labs where we are now creating diseases or modifying them or whatever for various purposes. It's kind of horrifying.
Yeah, the human stupidity factor comes in.
Yeah.
I was thinking more ChatGPT. But
Yeah.
We're going to wipe ourselves out with a robovirus. That's
Something, yes.
Yeah, why do conversations, I should really look in the mirror and say, why do conversations involving me always turn to topics like the apocalyptic
End of the world.
the Skynet.
Yes. You could be the link.
Maybe,
Oh, no.
maybe I need a little introspection.
We can change the subject.
Yeah, we'll do a little subject change. Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I'm just thinking about history in general. In our society, everything has become so polarized, and everything is so politicized. And I'm just curious about not being in the academy anymore. What is the state of history? You mentioned last night that classics is in the midst of self-immolation. I've read that elsewhere.
I would include history, English,
Yeah.
philosophy,
The
leave
humanities.
everybody out. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, just in general, how hard is it to do history in the academy now, and not produce something that's sort of more polemic than? Yeah. I mean, objectivity is always it's too bold of a statement, but in terms of doing what you do, how much is it done, and what's the state thereof?
Yeah, I mean, I think the so-called culture wars have, in a more public way over the last couple of years, gotten tangled up in public discourse with the practice and purpose of history, and you can look at some of the polemics around the 1619 Project or anything like that. I mean, we kind of know that this has been in public dialogue. In Oklahoma, there's a law that tries to prevent teaching critical race theory, and so these are sort of in the public square in a particular way over the last few years, shaped by the culture wars. But I think that's just the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper structural crisis in the humanities. And I mean, I imagine probably I'm guessing you have an intelligent listenership. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. These are some of the smartest listeners.
Cultivated.
All six of them.
Good taste. Good looking.
Yeah.
It's a burden for them, I'm sure. But maybe preaching a little to the choir. But just in case not, I mean, I think it needs to really be emphasized. I mean, it's a 5-alarm fire that the humanities are in the last throes of a mortal crisis that isn't simple. It isn't just reducible to the culture war polemics of the last few years, but have multiple causes, both inside and outside the humanities. I think one is that we have a system of education that prioritizes technical, vocational skills and credentials over humanistic values. And so what that means is students have a lot of incentive to think of, and I come from higher education. You could adapt this for other levels of our educational system. But students and their parents, who are very often writing the check, think of the purpose of education in terms of what's it going to get for me? What can I get with that degree? What kind of job does that open the doors for? And it's totally understandable. Everybody wants to earn a dignified livelihood and to be their best and to play a role in our economy and society. But when that is the purpose, fundamentally, it becomes the purpose to the exclusion of other ideas about what an education is. And so this plays out, for instance, in curricula. It plays out in hiring decisions. In curricula, it plays out in what courses are required and then what's actually taught. Because if you're going to be a computer science major, which our world needs lots of computer programmers for the coming global robot apocalypse. But
I thought we weren't talking about that.
we need lots of computer programmers, right? Of course we do. It's 2023. But is a college education about learning how to be a really talented and gifted programmer who can help improve some line of code somewhere that builds something shinier, more efficiently. That's good, but we want that computer programmer also to be a good person, to flourish, and not just to be a widget in a maybe high-tech assembly process, but instead to be the kind of person who has read books that are part of a very long and deep conversation about the purpose of human existence, about what's worth wanting, about the fallibility of humans. You want a computer programmer to have that, even for the purpose of being a thoughtful and responsible programmer. But beyond that, to be a good citizen, to participate in a society where the people govern themselves, to be a person who lives a rich and flourishing and full life, who appreciates truth and beauty and goodness. And if we don't believe that really, really fundamentally and stand up for it, and if we don't embed it in the curriculum, if it's not required for a computer science major to take those courses, then the computer science major won't, because college is expensive, as we all know, and that has contributed. That's a complicated element of this, is that as the price of college education has gone up for various reasons, it only reinforces the tendency to think, what is the material benefit of this? And so I just need to think about getting the skills to give me a credential that'll get me a job that will pay off the debt that I've taken on. And that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for thinking about these other purposes of education. But then as well, we live in a fractured society. We live in an age of fracture. And it's a pluralist society where people have so many different and incompatible visions of the human good, combined with so little remaining shared trust in institutions and ideas and inheritances, that it makes it very hard for people to say, I really think that these are great books, that all educated people ought to have the chance and even the obligation to read. And so when a culture doesn't even have, and you can have a pluralist culture that still has enough of a shared sense of common history, of a shared conversation about the good, that you can have a serious vision of education. But in our age of fracture, I think it's proven very hard to have enough of a consensus where people of very different worldviews might say, look, what's really important, even if we disagree on a lot, is that we find ways to have this deep conversation that does require engaging with philosophy and with literature and so on. And so I think it's a 5-alarm fire, and people of very different political ideologies, frankly, need to realize that actually there is enough of a shared basis of belief in the importance of the humanities. So I think for people on the right, they ought to listen and take seriously some of the criticisms of the way history and literature have been taught, and be willing to broaden the canon. I think that's important and extremely doable, and would result in an even richer education. But I also think people more on the left ought to try and listen and understand why people feel alienated sometimes by the way civic education actually happens. And I think that if people of goodwill don't actually work together to try and reverse this structural crisis, that what will happen is the humanities will just shrink and shrink and shrink, and nobody will stand up for the really fundamental importance of the humanities as part of a rich education. And then it'll all just be very high-end job training. And when the robot apocalypse comes, nobody will have read Moby Dick anyway, so what's the point?
I appreciate that you mentioned that there's on the one hand, the parents and the students in a, let's say, university situation are wanting this to be high-end job training and pretty much nothing more than that. But you also kind of, I think, tipped the hat to a lot of this is forcing parents and students into like the high cost of it, or just the curriculum that's on offer. A couple of my kids go to a university where you can get a great STEM education, and I suppose if you want to get a great liberal arts education in there, you might be able to do it. But I look at the curriculum and I have fully aware of what I'm saying, and someone who I think appreciates the humanities, as much as anyone, have said to them basically, make sure you have a degree where you can come out of this and get a good job. You're going to have to get your humanities, your theological education, such as it is, all of those things on your own, elsewhere. It's not going to be in the history of rock and roll class that you're taking, or this, whatever diversity class, where even the history class, history of Texas in this case, has nothing to do with the history of Texas actually. And the professor said this in the first week. But my kid's stuck in it, so it's like, okay, you're there now to get your engineering degree or whatever. And I hate saying that, but it's part of what is on offer out there. It's very frustrating.
We won't name any universities, I guess.
No, I guess not. But the other thing is when you describe what the kind of our society and humanity looks like here, widgets, in this system, I can't help but think of the description of society in books like Huxley's Brave New World or Orwell's 1984, where it's about being a cog in the system, and then entertainment and pleasure and all of that. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it does seem like there's, are there elites? Is there some force behind here just driving that, a totalitarian impulse, because people and societies are easier to control when they're not reading Plato or even Melville or whoever?
Well, the reason I tend not to be quite as conspiratorial, if that's fair or not way to put it, is just I generally don't think actually people are clever enough to organize.
I think most are not.
I think we can rely on the well
going
proven
the way the culture goes,
limits of human abilities, and realize that it has more to do with the kind of choices we make as a society about what to value.
It's a chicken and egg thing, I think. The first time I really became aware of how much in crisis we were was the first term of the Bush administration. he appointed a
Second
council.
Bush,
Yes,
43.
Bush 2. Yes,
Right.
Bush. Yes, him. Iraq debacle guy.
That'd be it.
Anyway, he appointed a council of bioethics, and they did something different than anyone had ever done. They brought in a bunch of humanities guys, Leon Cass and others, and they did they put out several volumes that were readers in the humanities for reflecting on what does it mean to be human. And they were utterly scorned for this. I mean, I loved it, because I like reading in the humanities and reading the classics, and some really, they were great readers. The next administration, the first thing they did was dismantle all of that and put back in a bioethics council that was basically just, you can do this, you can't do that. You can do this, you can't do that, rather than reflecting on what does it mean to be human. And I thought, that doesn't say something about that administration. It says something about our society that's much more interested in what can we do and what can't we do, rather than who are we and what are we about. I want to shift to another question here for you. And I've got a couple more, but I think I'll stick with this one. I was reading a guy who was retired, I think from Rutgers recently, and it was an opinion piece in a local paper somewhere, maybe in Florida, I don't remember. But he was basically saying, he was reacting to someone who said presentism is a bad thing. And he was saying presentism is absolutely necessary and what history needs to be about. It's really more, of what history is supposed to be doing than this idea of sort of objectively presenting the past and that sort of thing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, just in terms of, Lewis calls it chronological snobbery, and that sort of thing. We look back on previous generations and think how, immature or whatever, non-progressed they were. How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, these are debates that have been brewing, sometimes have been kind of intense in the professional side of the field, even in the last year or two. And I often find these conversations a little bit frustrating, just because I don't think it's an either or. And actually, I just don't think anybody can reasonably really say that either history should be presentist or non-presentist. And so presentist meaning that the way we write history is really oriented towards our contemporary concerns and inflected by the way we see the world, versus history is fundamentally about trying to recreate worlds that don't exist on their own terms, and to defamiliarize us with the past. And I think those are like the yin and yang. We just, in fact, they can draw energy from each other. I mean, certainly as a practicing historian who's written books on climate change and pandemic disease, I've no big problem with writing about the past in ways that are colored by the world that we live in. We're interested in climate change, and that means, among other things, one, we know a lot about it. I mean, we know a lot about the paleoclimate that we didn't know 10 or 20 years ago. And the reason why is because there's a lot of really good, well-funded earth science that's concerned with trying to understand the planet, trying to understand the history of the Earth system, to find archives like ice cores and tree rings and so on, to really deepen our understanding of the way the Earth's climate works, in order to create better models that can help us understand what's likely to happen. So we have lots of new information about the past that's completely driven by present anxieties about the environmental challenges we face. So why would we not want to leverage that new information that we just didn't know about climate change in the Roman Empire 10, 20 years ago? Now we know a lot. We're learning more, but it's completely driven by the present concern, climate change, which has created the data. And 25 years ago, the number of people who were interested in what climate change does to societies was much smaller than it is today. And so why wouldn't we want to write about the way the climate affects societies? And the reason they didn't 20 years ago is because it wasn't the same level of public conversation around the issue. So it's absolutely present as history. I write present as history unapologetically. I think it'd be extremely dumb to not pretend like we know this data or pretend that we're not interested in these questions. But at the same time, present as history can be limiting if we're only reading the past and interpreting the past through our own lens. Then you're not just limiting what you see, but you're really shortchanging yourself, because one of the really interesting things about the past is that it's different, and it's really different, and it's often very weird. And to me, that can be just so dizzying and exciting to really come up against something that's truly alien, whether it's a word or an idea or a technology or a ritual, and I think it's deeply humanizing to try and understand the way people made sense of human existence with different tools, with different terms, and to do it in a way that can be respectful. Doesn't mean we have to be sympathetic to everything they did in the past. It was often a very cruel and unfair place. So is the world that we live in and our own ways. But to try and maybe not judge first, but understand first is one of the highest callings of really good history. I just don't see why those are fundamentally incompatible. There's lots of history books written every year. There's going to be space for both. I've tried to do some of both in my own practice. So I think sometimes the debates about presentism end up being sort of really about something else.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you. Todd, we probably need to wrap this up. Don't you have a final question about historical presentism?
Right, everything is, as an historian, I just want to throw some numbers at you.
Okay.
And see what you think. Okay. If I were to say 63, 50, and 5, do you have any idea on that?
63 is the number of points that OU scored against Texas en route to our national championship.
Which was I think, the biggest win, wasn't it?
Except for the next year.
That's better.
That one was 63.
So we're talking
14.
about football now?
I'm sorry, what were you talking about?
No, that's good. I was just, I think historically speaking, it's important to note the all-time record of the Red River Shootout.
Oh, because of those wins in the 1900s.
Right, which is important.
When we had 6 players.
No. I mean, you're an ancient historian guy.
They were all named Archibald and had leather hats, and they were 5'2". I was looking up yesterday the stats that OU's won 2/3 of the games this millennium.
Yeah, we're not talking about that. This millennium is terrible.
Well, who won last year?
Last year was an exception.
Who's going to win this year?
Definitely. Well, I can't wait to find out. I hope Texas.
No
is
prognostication.
I hope Texas is ranked number 1 when that game happens.
Oh, that would be amazing.
That'd be so
because
fun.
then they could just hold on to it afterwards.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
We do.
If they're not before, they will be.
We love every year that Texas is back, and I mean it's easily Texas is definitely the greatest preseason football program in the country.
Yeah. My wife is an Aggie. We had a really bad fight Saturday night. So it was really not good.
Okay, well, we should probably end on that note before we keep going with it. I want to thank Kyle for being here with us today for this conversation. It's been
and last night was great.
Really great. Yeah,
we'll be getting that up on our YouTube page
for sure. Yeah. So thank you all for listening today to Theological Table Talk, and check out our resources we're going to have on our YouTube page very soon. If not already, the video from the First Things and Center for Christian Studies lecture that was last night. with Kyle Harper. And if you've enjoyed this program, please consider donating to the Center for Christian Studies. Go to our website, christian-studies.org. And also email us any ideas you have for podcast conversation at info@christian-studies.org. And thank you for joining us at the table today.